Thank you, everybody, for being here. This is wonderful to see all these faces in person and on Zoom. Thank you, Andrew, for that introduction. In the spirit of my previous talk on happiness, gratitude, and neuroplasticity, I want to start by also thanking Cassandra Henning, who's on Zoom with us there, for her hard work and continued personal inspiration. She works tirelessly and effortlessly, making this place what it is. I would also like to thank the larger Theosophical Society in Seattle and abroad. This group makes a very little point of asking, but this space, this library, the talks and workshops, meditations, and programs are possible through donations. They're working hard to fix their roof, as well as the plumbing in this 110-year-old structure. Go to seattletheosophy.org/donate, or you can donate here in the little wicker basket. It makes all this possible, and you don't end up on any sort of list where they bother you. Just consider it a donation. So to start, I want to just recognize the fact that we live in this. Get my, yeah, exactly. I can't keep that anymore. We live in this beautiful place. Seattle has so much greenery, so many green spaces that we can explore. I hope everyone has shared the experience that I'm going to describe. Going out into the woods or a forest, it doesn't have to be far, national park, anything like that, just any green wooded place, and travel to a place where you can't see the parking lot anymore. Don't take your children, your friends, your dog. Take your headphones out and try to not define any individual tree or plant. Just fall into the scene. Listen to the life around you and allow your eyes to blur into a soft sea of green and feel it in your body. More than likely, you will have an experience that says simply, listen. It's not spoken, and you don't hear it with your ears. But if you're tuned in, you can feel it with your whole body. There's a porous quality to it. In that moment, you're aware that we exhale carbon dioxide and plants exhale oxygen. For a planet that's 70% nitrogen, that's a pretty nice function. We've literally breathed each other in and out of existence. Humans and plants made by the exhalation of one another. And yet, humans believe that we're the most dominant species on Earth. But when you look at the numbers, it just doesn't hold up. In terms of population, humans make up less than 0.01% of life on Earth. The animal kingdom is just 0.4% of all life. The plant kingdom clearly dominates the Earth, making up 82% of all life. That would mean that there would have to be 56 trillion people on Earth to get anywhere close to being the dominant life form as plants. Plants have a 125 million year head start over the very first land vertebrates, and a 425 million year head start on the first humans. Plants literally made the world before us and for us. Plants are cognizant of a greater purpose. In addition to their own very clear Darwinian success, they have a purpose to the community in which they live. But before posing any question of exactly what plant consciousness is, or what consciousness is, we must determine what we're talking about in the first place. People use the word consciousness in a variety of ways. For example, a state of wakefulness. I'm currently conscious. I hope you all are too. A sense of self. I am conscious of a stain on my shirt, or the capacity for self-reflection. But when we want to single out the mysterious quality of the heart of consciousness, it's important to narrow it down to what makes it unique. Thomas Nagel wrote one of the first essays on this subject entitled, "What is it like to be a bat?" The essence of Nagel's explanation is as follows. Simply put, an organism is conscious if there is something that it is like to be that organism. Consciousness is what we're referring to when we discuss experience in its most basic form. Is it like something to be you in this moment? I should hope so. Is it like something to be me? Is it like something to be the chair you're sitting on? Only in the most abstract of ways. And as for our current understanding, no, we don't know what it's like to be a chair. It's this simple difference, whether there's been an experience or not, that's become the classical definition of consciousness. Is it something to be like a grain of sand, a virus, a tree, an ant, a mouse, my dog, you, me? At some point along the spectrum, we choose an answer of yes. So the great question arises, why do the lights turn on for certain collections of matter in the universe and not for others? We can even wonder at what point a human being's consciousness begins. Imagine a blastocyst of less than 20 cells. We assume there's nothing that it is to be like this microscopic collection of cells. But with time, these cells multiply into a human with a human brain, able to detect changes in light and temperature and voices. Unlike a computer or mechanism that can detect changes in light or recognize a voice, these processes come with an experience. The individual experiences the light and sound. At whatever point your intuition tells you, okay, now something is being experienced, the real mystery lies in the transition. At some point, there is nothing, and then suddenly, at just the right, indefinable moment, there is something. However minimal that initial something is, experience explodes in the inanimate world, bringing light to darkness. After all, the infinite is made of particles indistinguishable from those in our sun. The particles that make up our bodies were once the stuff of stars in the universe's past. Like Carl Sagan said, if you want to make an apple pie from scratch, you need to go back to the beginning of the universe. And it's the very same for us. All these tiny particles traveled billions of years in this great conflagration to create you, having an experience of this talk in this moment. Imagine following the life of those particles from the very beginning in space and time to the very moment they became arranged in such a way as to start experiencing something as you. If we can't find this divining line or moment, which we still have not, this leaves the question, is consciousness everywhere? When we look closely, we can't find reliable external physical evidence of consciousness, nor can we point to the function that it serves. If we can't point to anything that distinguishes which atoms are conscious and which are not, where can we draw the line? A more interesting and subversive question would be, why draw the line at all? When we view our own experiences as being along for the ride, observing inside our own experiences as our free selves, we can consider the possibility that all matter is imbued with consciousness. This view is what the Renaissance figure Francisco Patrizzi and the modern philosopher David Chalmers refer to as panpsychism. If the behavior of animals, including ourselves, can be imbued with consciousness, why not plants or electrons? Perhaps consciousness is a fundamental property of matter. It's worth posing the question, and to me, it's the only logical explanation. Consciousness is part of the fundamental physical forces and fields like gravity, electromagnetism, and light and heavy nuclear forces. This approach is wild, but it is informed with science and is fully aligned with scientific reasoning. As the philosopher Philip Goff said, panpsychism is crazy, but it's most likely probably true. Physics tells us nothing about the intrinsic nature of matter, other than that physical matter has experience. Simply put, panpsychism just makes logical sense. It's the simplest, most straightforward explanation for what Chalmers refers to as the hard problem of consciousness. The question of plant consciousness, when taken from this perspective, inherently breaks the taxonomic boundary. Plant knowledge is in and with plants themselves, not to be interpreted, never lost, always available. Plants co-evolve with humans. New properties and new functions emerge as new needs develop. Plants are a conscious population far greater and older than us. Unfortunately, the taxonomy that cemented our current understanding of plants dates back to Aristotle, perhaps the most influential thinker of all of Western history. By defining quote unquote insensitivity as the key criteria for differentiating plants from animals, including human beings, Aristotle positioned plants outside the domain of sensitive life. He essentially, in effect, transformed plants into objects. A spurious idea that allows humans the rights to use and abuse plants and that exempt us from any sense of responsibility or respect as living beings. Aristotle's perspective on the sensorial world had a profound and long-lasting influence on everyone that came after him, beginning with his own pupil, Theophrastus, never said these out loud, who, despite his own observations of active behavior in many different plant species, blindly ascribed to his mentor Aristotle's belief of plant passivity and insensitivity. Unfortunately, this ancient misconception was passed down for millennia, going against what we know of the Darwinian theory of natural selection itself. Greater diversity and genetic variation ensures greater ecosystem stability. Systems more resilient to stress and recovery from adverse conditions are invariably the more diverse. The uniformity of Aristotle does not include the blurring of the taxonomic boundary that we see all the time, especially as it relates to the panpsychical approach to animal and plant consciousness. In 1966, a CIA polygraph technician named Cleve Baxter was working late when he fixated on a potted plant in his office, a small, succulent shrub. He was familiar with the work of the early 20th century researcher and physicist Jagadish Chandra Bose, who claimed to have discovered that playing certain kinds of music in the area where plants grew caused them to grow faster. Cleve Baxter wondered, what would happen if he hooked this plant up to a polygraph machine? You can guess where this went, and there was only one way to find out. Baxter attached electrodes to the succulent leaves. He switched on the polygraph and watched the readings as he added water to the plant's soil. Shockingly, the galvanometer jumped. The plant was giving off spikes of satisfied energy. Taking things a step further, he visualized himself setting the plant on fire. With nothing but a thought, the plant's polygraph reading spiked. With this information, Baxter and anyone else has to wonder, can plants read our minds? Baxter and his team experimented with dozens of types of plants, including fruits and vegetables, and his records all indicated similar results. Most plants can sense a human's thoughts or intentions before they are acted upon. Despite the occasional dubious results, Cleve Baxter's work became the legitimate field of study known as plant neurobiology, which is a complete misnomer. Plants don't have brains or neurons. They do have a chemical system that sends signals through their body, simulating what we could understand as a central nervous system. For example, plants respond to chemicals in the air, on their leaves, and in their roots. The only explanation is that they can taste and smell these. Plants can essentially see. How else could you describe the way they react differently depending on light and shadow? When a root or a vine comes across a foreign object, it knows to grow around it, just like our sense of touch. And in one experiment, the researcher Michael Pollan found plants secreted defensive chemicals when he played a recording of a munching caterpillar. So plants can even hear. At the Beijing, China Agricultural University, researchers expanded on Jagadish Chandra Bose's theory in an industrial scale. They found plants yield more produce when they regularly listen to music. They proved unequivocally that music improved plants like cucumbers, peppers, spinach, cotton, and rice's ability to fight off diseases and molds. And scientists continue to test these theories. Today, you'd be hard-pressed to go to any science fair and not see a student testing out positive and negative affirmations on plants. My own good friend, Soraya Doset, in receiving her Reiki certification, did a test with grains of rice, sending positive thoughts to one dish of rice and negative thoughts in another. Unsurprisingly, the dish that received the negative stimulation was moldy, whereas the one that received the positive Reiki appeared brand new. I had my own strange experience with this phenomenon when I was in college. I would walk back from the school in the evenings to my aunt who I was living with in North Seattle. And I noticed on this walk at a certain point, I would hear slight conversations, little chittering, sort of like elves. After wondering what this was, I investigated further and discovered that my neighbor's planters had tiny speakers installed, and that this person's lush, verdant garden was being grown with podcasts and talk radio. Plants actually have 10 to 15 more senses than humans do, in addition to the 5 I described. Plants can detect gravity, pressure, volume, toxins, and harmful microbes. If a plant can receive this information, it stands to reason that it can make decisions based upon it, like where they want their roots to grow, how many fruiting bodies to produce, or how to respond to external threats. Every plant is an individual and a free thinker. Biologist Monica Gagliano and her team at the University of Western Australia devised a test to see how well peas could hear, with surprising results. She started by placing several pea shoots in a simple upside-down Y-shaped piece of PVC pipe. So there's a top and then 2 bottoms. Plants can sense what's known as the soil moisture gradient. But what if both sides of the Y-shaped pipe contained the exact same level of soil moisture, but one end was fitted with a speaker, playing the sounds of running water? I, along with Gagliano and her team, would assume that the pea's roots would move towards the sound of the flowing water. But to her surprise, they did not. In fact, in most cases, the roots avoided the end playing the sound of running water. It wasn't until another speaker playing white noise was attached to the other end of the growing pipe did the pea roots decide to move in the direction of the running water, every single time. What this team had inadvertently discovered was that the roots had the ability to perceive the mildest electromagnetic field given off by the speakers. It was only when both ends had speakers attached did the little pea roots make the decision to go to the sound of the rushing water. In addition, it's been proven that plants can even recall the past. In a 2014 study, that same team at the University of Western Australia proved certain plants form memories. Monica Gagliano and her team studied an incredible plant known as Mimosa pudica. This plant has the unique ability to coil its leaves when it senses danger. Mimosa's powerful performance of folding and unfolding its leaves in a way reminds us of the purposeful movement of animals, creating a strange and extraordinary bridge between the so-called sensitive and insensitive line that Aristotle said separated animals and vegetal kingdoms. Could they use the mimosa's sensitivity to test plant learning, memory, and decision-making? Could she create Pavlovian plants? Long-term memory can be described in relation to changes in synaptic connectivity expressed in the brain. Our memories are a thought that interacts with a wide range of molecules across complex networks. Understood from this perspective, memory is inevitably contingent on the existence of a brain. But from there, we paint ourselves into a corner. Frail arguments to advance our knowledge, such as plants have no brain and no synapses to retain memory. Therefore, how can they do any actual remembering? During this study, Gagliano placed the mimosas in small cups and dropped the plant repeatedly from a height of a few centimeters, every 5 seconds. Each time it dropped, the plant retracted its leaves. But after several impacts, something interesting happened. The plant stopped defending itself. It kept its leaves in the outward position. The team of researchers placed the plants on vibrating plates as a control, and they again recoiled their leaves. Gagliano tested the plants 3 days later with the same results. It did not recoil when dropped, proving that this plant remembered for days. It hadn't gotten hurt the last few times it fell. It wasn't going to get hurt this time. So whether the Mimosa pudica was remembering Gagliano, being packed into a cup, being put on the slider that she used to drop them, we don't know. But the team continued the study on dozens of mimosa plants, all with similar results. No one can figure out how they make these memories, especially if they don't have a brain. So far, our best guess is that plants use calcium-based network that simulates neurons. There's also overwhelming evidence that plants can recognize one another, specifically seeds that are related to them. In 2007, a Canadian science team monitored a plant known as the sea rocket. The seeds from the same mother plant grew next to each other, and the new buds competed less aggressively for resources. They cooperated as family members. Another study at the University of Delaware found plants that grew next to related organisms were more likely to intertwine their roots and work together. Those that grew next to strangers sprouted upright and avoided direct contact with their neighbors. Additionally, there is evidence that plants form alliances across species. Imagine an alien intelligence studying the human race for the last decade and just finding out that we used the internet yesterday. That's essentially what happened with the recent discovery of what biologists have affectionately referred to as the Wood Wide Web. This is a web of mycelial fungus that wraps around the tangled roots of the majority of the world's trees. It acts like an organic internet. As researcher Merlin Sheldrake inelegantly describes it, almost all trees on planet Earth are web pages, and this mycelial fungal network is acting as hyperlinks. He says it's inelegant because Sheldrake admits that that's just the best way we can understand it, and the reality is far more difficult for us to comprehend. This mycelial network allows trees to send messages to other plants. They can even search for information they need for their environment. This is how trees share water and other nutrients that they might be lacking. It's how a shaded tree acquires resources from one with more abundant sun. They can also send distress signals if they're attacked. Trees aren't beholden to this fungal network. They can also release pheromones and other scent signals into the air. In sub-Saharan Africa, giraffes love to eat the leaves of the acacia tree. When a giraffe begins munching on the acacia, it emits a gas, telling neighboring plants to produce more tannins in their leaves. This, over time, makes the foliage bitter to the giraffe, and in large enough quantities could actually kill them. Plants can organize to react and even kill one of the largest land mammals. There's countless spiritual and religious plant life that occurs throughout our shared records. From the Druids with their sacred oaks, crowns of laurels, roses, or the holy throne tree. But one plant could be argued to occur the most in historical, cultural, and spiritual significance. That would be Nelumbo nucifera, or the sacred lotus flower. There's a nice diagram of a sacred lotus flower. It is a sacred flower in both Hinduism and Buddhism, representing the creation of the universe, the path to spiritual awakening and enlightenment. It holds significance for the Jains of India and early Christians. In ancient Egypt, it grew on the banks of the Nile, representing the path from death to rebirth in the afterlife. It's an important position in yoga, and who could forget the islands of lotus eaters Odysseus encounters in Greek mythology? But what about this plant, besides its obvious beauty, has made it so captivating? It truly is one of a kind. Starting at the roots. The roots grow in the mud below the water. Not floating like seaweed, Nelumbo nuciferia anchors itself in the earth element. The roots connected in an edible tuber instead of the standard root bunch for other aquatic plants. It then grows through a watery element. And this is very important. Its seed pods, leaves, and flowers bloom far off the surface of the water in an airy element. Most other aquatic plants, water lilies, for example, don't do this. They stay on the surface of the water and spread out. Only the sacred lotus flower moves through all three elements. There's a fourth primordial element the lotus embodies. Can anyone guess?
Fire.
Fire. Very good. What element of fire could you see in a lotus there? Leaves, yes, that's what I was thinking.
Yeah.
Purple and blue flowers of the lotus could certainly represent the fiery element. Oh, there's my fire right there. But there's a more exciting discovery being made. In 2018, researchers at the University of Wollongong in Australia created these infrared images you see up top. Turns out, Nelumbo nuciferia is part of a rare group of plants that are thermogenic. Thermogenic plants have the ability to raise their temperature above that of the surrounding air. Heat is generated in the mitochondria as a secondary process of cellular respiration. This thermogenesis is similar to the process of uncoupling proteins found in mammals, enabling the same process, which is still poorly understood in plants. The Araceae family of flowering plants contain the most species that are thermogenic. The skunk cabbage, elephant foot yam, and voodoo lily all produce heat in ways similar to mammals. Outside of this family, though, only the sacred lotus flower shows a thermogenic process. It's also the only plant in the world that we know of to be both thermogenic, it produces heat, and endothermic, it's able to regulate its flower's temperature. It's the only photosynthetic organism to be known to do this. As these thermo images show, they're black and white, but I'll show you color ones if you want. Here's the flower in situ, here's the elements of the flower, and then you can see where the heat is radiating. The stamens of the flower produce a tremendous amount of heat and continue this process of cellular respiration even after being detached from the whole flower. After learning about this elemental nature of the lotus flower, I was curious to know, could I figure out who was the first god of plant and vegetation? our first divine personification of the growing world. This is difficult since individual plants contain their own spirits, gods for the grain, the harvest, and so on. But I believe the ancient Mesopotamian patron god Nebu from 3500 BC to be a compelling candidate as the first plant god. His name in Akkadian means to announce and prophesize. He was the third and only living son of the god Marduk and the patron deity of Babylon, or Marduk was the patron deity of Babylon. Nebu was the patron god of scribes, literacy, and wisdom. He invented writing, the rational arts, and was the god and overseer of all of vegetation. Nebu inscribed the fates of men, along with the god Ninurta, the god of law and farming. Nebu's cult spread to ancient Egypt and was one of only 5 non-Egyptian deities to be worshipped on the island of Elephantine in Upper Egypt. Over the centuries, Nebu influenced the Egyptian gods Amun, Osiris, and Thoth. He's associated with Mercury and Hermes, and in the Mandean cosmology, the name for Mercury is Nebu, NBU. I find it fascinating and initially a little confusing that Nebu and Ninurta were both early gods of writing, the law, vegetation, and farming, whereas all later cultures separated the two. Osiris represented plant life, and Thoth represented writing in ancient Egypt, for example. Until you consider the origin of the Mesopotamian system of writing, cuneiform, example of someone writing cuneiform down there, the first written language. Today we use a pen and paper, a laptop, computer, or a smartphone to communicate. But the earliest language was simply grown and plucked. The land of Mesopotamia was built on rich clay. In order to write a letter, a receipt, create a story, one simply had to scoop a small handful of clay and break off a nearby reed. The clay would be cradled in the left hand while the right hand would create a system of notches in the wet clay. No stationery stores or receipt paper. Communication was simply grown and plucked from the earth. Now it starts to make sense that Nebu is the god of writing, logic, and plant life. And ultimately, that's the role of plant consciousness, in my opinion. Communication with us and communication to us as individuals. Plants feed us and they teach us. They're greater in number and wiser in history than we could ever hope to be. Plants show us that all knowledge is borrowed knowledge. There is nothing that we can teach a plant. They literally helped create us. They hold the answers, but it's up to us to decide on the questions. We must move from notions of ownership to ones of custodian. Go back to the woods, back to the green space where you can't see the parking lot anymore. Surround yourself and try to just listen. Thank you.